So this is a video series on the classic work written by Bram Stoker, Dracula. The reason I am recording this series of videos about the book is because there is probably, arguably, fewer books in the pantheon of English literature that has been so terribly handled by popular culture, to the point that as we get into the content and as we work our way through this content, perhaps you will come to the same conclusion that I came to, that not only is this a severely mishandled work and the author maliciously how do I say this? His reputation being undermined. Bram Stoker these days in literary circles is considered to have been a man with deep gay desires, homosexual desires, and that these desires had to be suppressed because of the late 19th century Victorian principles, I guess, and that he wrote Dracula as an outlet for these innate desires. But if you do the research, you actually see that Bram Stoker was a committed Anglo-Catholic. That is, he was in the Church of England, but he was high church to the point of there's a culture in the Anglican Church known as Anglo-Catholicism, which is to say he essentially was an English Catholic, sans the Pope. So in a way, Lutheran. In a way, probably. I don't know enough about his theological background, whether he was more Calvinistic or Lutheran. I tend to think he was probably fell more on the Lutheran side, and the reason I say that is the way he wrote Dracula and what it is he's trying to get across. His book is fiercely anti-rationalism, and we'll unpack those kinds of things. And I think that's another reason why this book has been so, in my opinion, deliberately subverted. This is a book that has a lot of different concepts that liberal society, I mean that with a capital L, would like to appropriate for their own purposes. And that's all well and good. I mean, if they want to have if they want literature that is going to promote their ideology, that's fair. But they ought to use literature of their own making instead of taking a book like Dracula and turning it into something else. And frankly, given the themes of this book, which is good versus evil at the deepest spiritual level, being a Lutheran myself and fully believing in spiritual warfare, as St. Paul shows us in his epistles, especially in the book of Ephesians, but also St. John the Evangelist, as he shows, also Jude, as he demonstrates, and Jesus himself, of course. I think that the reason why this book has ended up being so maligned is because the devil himself is at war with it, because this book is that potent, is that powerful. And that's why I want to unpack this methodically and slowly so that people can see this book for what it is, and why so many Christians such as myself read this book on a regular basis for inspiration in the real spiritual warfare, the real cosmic fight between good and evil between the cosmic forces and the principalities, and Christendom. So what we're going to do is, starting with this particular episode, we're going to go through this book, start to finish. And the way I'm going to do this is, because this book is very unique. It was written in a style of journal entries, mostly. And so every single part of this book is dated. The chapters don't always follow the dates per se, but generally speaking they do. So there are times, like for instance, at the end of chapter 1, you begin on the 5th of May, but chapter 2 continues the 5th of May. So in those cases, that's why I'm not really going to be doing this by chapter. I'm going to be doing this by date. And we'll go through this book, and we're going to see just how much this book is about spiritual warfare. We'll see how this book has been caricatured and parodied and subverted into something in the modern culture that the literature itself never was. There is, in my humble opinion, a direct spiritual attack against this book. And certain political ideologies in the West are all too happy to aid and abet our cosmic foes in doing this. So let's begin. Bram Stoker's Dracula. And we begin with Jonathan Harker's journal entry on the 3rd of May. And this is a rather short entry, so I'll just read it so we can kind of start to get a bit of a feel of it. So, 3rd of May in Bistritz. And so Bistritz is the capital of Romania. So he's writing this entry from Eastern Europe. And he says, left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on the 1st of May, arriving at Vienna early next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46, but train was an hour late. Budapest seems a wonderful place, from the glimpse which I got of it from the train and the little I could walk through the streets. I feared to go very far from the station, as we had arrived late and would start as near the correct time as possible. The impression I had was that we were leaving the west and entering the east. The most western of splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of noble width and depth, took us among the traditions of Turkish rule. Now I'm going to stop there, because I think right there we have a very important line. The impression I had was that we were leaving the west and entering the east. This is basically, to use modern parlance, Dorothy, we aren't in Kansas anymore. We are transitioning from the Western culture to the Eastern culture, and the Eastern culture is very different than the Western culture, even and especially in the 19th century. So this is Stoker's way of saying, you got to recalibrate your mind, you got to resync your mind. Western reader, you're going to be going into a very different part of the world. And subtext, Christianity. Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity are two different cultures. Eastern Christianity tends to be much more mystical, much more ethereal. There is a deep and abiding, active spirituality that's always bubbling to the surface and even beyond that. Whereas, in Western society, we're a bit more rigid, stoic, proper. So this book is setting up a kind of a war between proper and mystery, if you will, rational, properness and mystery. So that is a very important line of transition for you, the reader, to know. That's a signal of, reader, be prepared for a very different experience than you may be expecting. So the character, Jonathan Harker, continues in his entry, we left in pretty good time and came after nightfall to Klausenburg. Here I stopped for the night at the Hotel Royal. I had for dinner, or rather supper, a chicken done up some way with red pepper, which was very good but thirsty. Note to self, get recipe for Mina. Mina is his, at this stage of the story, his fiance, and she is going to be a vastly important and exciting character. I asked the waiter, and he said it was called paprika handel, and that as it was a national dish, I should be able to get it anywhere along the Carpathians. I found my smattering of German very useful here. Indeed, I don't know how I should be able to get on without it. Having had some time at my disposal when in London, I had visited the British Museum and made search among the books and maps in the library regarding Transylvania. It had struck me that some foreknowledge of the country could hardly fail to have some importance in dealing with a nobleman of that country. I find that the district he named is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of 3 states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. I was not able to light on any map or work giving the exact locality of the Castle Dracula, as there are no maps of this country as yet to compare with our own Ordnance Survey maps. But I found that Bistritz, the post town named by Count Dracula, is a fairly well-known place. I shall enter here some of my notes, as they may refresh my memory when I talk over my travels with Mina. In the population of Transylvania there are 4 distinct nationalities: Saxons in the south, and mixed with them the Wallachs, who are the descendants of the Dacians, Magyars in the west, and Zekelkis in the east and north. I may not be pronouncing all these properly. I'm doing my best. I am going among the latter, who claim to be descended from Attila and the Huns. This may be so, for when the Magyars conquered the country in the 11th century, they found the Huns settled in it. I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some sort of imaginative whirlpool. If so, my stay may be very interesting. Note to self, I must ask the Count all about them. So you see, even here, the character is getting this sense that he is leaving a very known part of Western culture that doesn't tend to deal with superstition. You know, it's a very rationalist culture that is embracing Darwinism and the sciences and the Industrial Revolution, and everything is very tangible. And he is already detecting as a character that he's entering a part of the world, a part of Europe, that is going to be very different. I find it interesting that he says he goes to the museum and the library to learn something of this culture, and he's going to find out very quickly how very much unprepared he is, because he's relying on Western notions of a part of Europe, and the museum and library that he visits are clearly woefully inept. They are not able to prepare a upstanding British country gentleman for exactly what he's going to face at the castle of Count Dracula. And I think there, Stoker again is giving us an indication of where he's going to be going with this story, that we as Westerners are woefully unprepared for a spiritual attack, a true spiritual attack from hell itself. Harker continues, I did not sleep well, though my bed was comfortable enough, for I had all sorts of queer dreams. There was a dog howling all night under my window, which may have had something to do with it, or it may have been the paprika, for I had to drink up all the water in my carafe, and was still thirsty. Towards morning I slept and was wakened by the continuous knocking at my door, so I guess I must have been sleeping soundly then. I had for breakfast more paprika and a sort of porridge of maize flour, which they said was mamaliga, and eggplants stuffed with forcemeat, a very excellent dish which they call implatata. Note to self, get recipe for this also. I had to hurry breakfast, for the train started a little before 8, or rather it ought to have done so, for after rushing to the station at 7:30, I had to sit in the carriage for more than an hour before we began to move. It seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the trains. What ought they be in China? All day long we seemed to dawdle through a country which was full of beauty of every kind. Sometimes we saw little towns or castles on the top of steep hills, such as we see in old missals. Sometimes we ran by rivers and streams which seemed from the wide stony margin on each side of them to be subject to great floods. It takes a lot of water and running strong to sweep the outside edge of a river clear. At every station there were groups of people, sometimes crowds, and in all sorts of attire. Some of them were just like the peasants at home or those I saw coming through France and Germany, with short jackets and round hats and homemade trousers. But others were very picturesque. The women looked pretty except when you got near them. Ouch. But they were very clumsy about the waist. They had all full white sleeves of some kind or other, and most of them had big belts with a lot of strips of something fluttering from them like the dresses in a ballet. But of course there were petticoats under them. The strangest figures we saw were the Slovaks, who were more barbarian than the rest, with their big cowboy hats, great baggy dirty white trousers, white linen shirts, and enormous heavy leather belts, nearly a foot wide, all studded over with brass nails. They wore high boots with their trousers tucked into them, and had long black hair and heavy black moustaches. They are very picturesque, but do not look prepossessing. On the stage they would be set down at once as some old oriental band of brigands. They are, however, I am told, very harmless, and rather wanting in natural self-assertion. It was on the dark side of twilight when we got to Bistritz, which is a very interesting old place, being practically on the frontier, for the Borgo Pass leads from it into Bukovina. It has had a very stormy existence, and it certainly shows marks of it. 50 years ago, a series of great fires took place which made terrible havoc on 5 separate occasions. At the very beginning of the 17th century, it underwent a siege of 3 weeks and lost 13,000 people, the casualties of war proper being assisted by famine and disease. Count Dracula had directed me to go to the Golden Krone Hotel, which I found, to my great delight, to be thoroughly old-fashioned, for of course I wanted to see all I could of the ways of the country. I was evidently expected, for when I got near the door I faced a cheery-looking elderly woman in the usual peasant dress, white undergarment with long double apron, front and back, of colored stuff fitting almost too tight for modesty. When I came close she bowed and said, "The Herr Englishman?" "Yes," I said, "Jonathan Harker." She smiled and gave some message to an elderly man in white shirt sleeves, who had followed her to the door. He went, but immediately returned with a letter. "My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight. At 3 tomorrow the diligence will start for Bukovina. A place on it is kept for you. At the Borgo Pass my carriage will await you and bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been a happy one, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Dracula." See, so this opening journal entry probably has nothing that you expected. Where is the overdeveloped sexuality that we always see in so many adaptations of Dracula? You know, the constant lust and the constant, voluptuous women and the sexual tension and all these things. It's not here. And I will tell you here now that if you're looking for that in this story, you will not find it. It does exist in pockets, but Stoker is always using that sexual tension and imagery and drama to get at something specific. So when it comes, it is deliberate and it is overt and it is intended to serve a purpose. But 96% of this book is not sexuality, is not sexual tension. So whenever these things are dumped on this book, they are imported from the outside by a school of people or groups of creatives who have a very deliberate, contrary idea than what Stoker is interested in. The overdeveloped sexuality that we see in TV and film adaptations are really there to serve a desire to entertain and to titillate and to feed this pervasive, overdeveloped sexuality that we have in our culture. But it is all very foreign to the original literature. It is being imposed on the text. I also want to call attention to Dracula, his note to Jonathan Harker. You notice how congenial and amicable it is? Much like the devil coming into paradise and tempting Eve. He comes off as a friend. The devil wants your guard down, and Dracula wants Jonathan Harker's guard down. Jonathan Harker is the first piece in a very large scheme that Dracula has, which is going to reach all the way to the shores of England. But he needs Harker to be at ease, guard down, so that he can work his malice. And so this is another indication of just how spiritual, just how Christian this story is. Because you have Dracula, he is going to be the devil here. Certainly an agent of the devil. And so we can expect him to be not the kind of caricatured, horns, pitchfork, obvious evil that we so often get in entertainment with all villains in this kind of a horror setting. You know, these whenever they do horror films and jump scares, so often the evil is obvious and detectable. You can feel it coming into the room even before it comes into the room. Here, you're not going to get that, because Dracula presents himself as a gentleman, and in many cases beautiful. Much like the devil, we are reminded in Scripture that the devil is an angel of light, and he has maintained this persona, which is why we have to be so careful of him. It's why he is so effective in his deceptions and lies and temptations. And the character of Dracula is the same way. So we'll continue with the next entry in the next episode of this. And my intent is that I will do one of these episodes and it will match the date of the entry. So this was the 3rd of May. So on the 3rd of May, I will, do an entry. So the next entry is the 4th of May, so tomorrow. But then there are times where there are gaps in the journal entries. I think upcoming we have like the end of May, there's an entry, and then Jonathan Harker doesn't have another entry until June 17th. And so there would be a break. But by all means, feel free to continue to read and then be prepared. So that's my desire, is to do that. Now at the moment I'm catching up, so right now the dates of me posting this and the dates of the journal entry aren't going to match, because I'm just finishing up my 4th seminary year, and so I wasn't able to quite get into this as when I wanted. Plus at the moment I'm working with a Kindle version of the book. I have another copy of the book, physical copy of the book, where I have notes in, which I hope to have access to sooner than later, but right now I'm not able to have access to it. So for now I'm going to be using this Kindle version, trying to remember a bunch of the notes that I had made when I read this last year. So hope you enjoyed this, and on to the next.